Hello, welcome to week 4. I'm calling this week Volcanoes and Caverns, Paternal Procreations in Feminist Texts. This week we're talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as well as the film Splice and the film The Descent. This lecture will mostly focus on Frankenstein, but I do want to bring the films in. And because this is our last lecture together, I just want to emphasize that the big takeaway from this course for me is that feminist inquiry can rescue horror from being dismissed as low culture. I think all of the texts that we've looked at this semester are on the surface sought after as sort of guilty pleasures or cheap bodily thrills. But I think feminist inquiry can show that there is much more at stake in horror narrative than whether or not we shiver or scream in response to a text. So some of the key concepts for this week, I want to review the Descent narrative structure that Janice Rushing goes over, which we talked about during the first week. I also want to explore what makes something a feminist text. I want to make sure we understand Frankenstein's monster as a critique of patriarchal social structures. I want to trace the development of film concepts from narrative and novelistic structures. And I also would like to understand Shelley's novel as a foundational text for situating women in the horror genre. So I want to start by talking about The Descent and how it relates to Rushing's Descent myth structure. I think this is the scariest film by far in some ways that I had you watch this semester. But I think it's also perhaps in some ways the most feminist. The film definitely passes the Bechdel test. There's only one man in the film, and he's pretty much eliminated in the first scene. Sarah's adulterous husband, right? This film is feminist when read through Rushing's archetypal model. But I also think if you apply to gender ideology, it would also read as feminist. It obviously follows a Descent narrative structure. The title helps, right? The Descent. This is also, I think, a frontier myth, which Rushing talks about. The border between above ground and below is sort of being transgressed at the same time that Sarah's mental capacity between sanity and maybe insanity is being transgressed as well. Juno is the character who makes the descent of these 6 women into a sort of discovery narrative about. She doesn't tell them that the cave they are exploring has never been explored before until they're already situated within it. Sarah is sort of the goddess in this structure, right? She loses her half when she loses her daughter in the beginning, not her husband, and she's haunted by her daughter and a birthday cake. It's not like she longs for her husband. When she wakes up after the accident, she runs seeking her daughter Jessie, not her husband. So this is what she loses at the beginning, just in the same way that Ripley loses her daughter at the beginning of Aliens. And she must descend and fight the devouring mother in order to be made whole again. She is reborn, as Robinson points out, twice, when she emerges from this ooze as a sort of counter-dweller in the cave, and then again when she escapes the cave, when she sort of pops out at the end in kind of a monstrous birth scene. When she learns to counter-dwell, she accepts her lower world self. She takes out an entire monstrous nuclear family. She kills this mother. She kills one of the monsters, and then it turns out it was this mother sort of wants revenge for her lost child, and then she also kills what could be read as a husband as well. While the monsters they encounter could be read as male and female, here the women are not being associated with the monsters, as in Jurassic Park, as Williams argues, where all the dinosaurs are female. Instead, Sarah's demons of grief and loss become literalized in this disorienting pit. Robinson argues that this film also doesn't depict misogynistic violence towards women since the monsters themselves are blind. So the female gaze is the only gaze that's really operating in this film. From Sarah using the handheld camera to watching her fellow traveler, Holly, be devoured, or even the spotlights sort of create this kind of telescopic gaze. And I think it's also possible to read Juno, who's named after a deceptive Roman goddess, and who accidentally kills Beth, and who deliberately committed adultery with Sarah's husband when he was alive. It's also possible to read her as the devouring goddess. The significance of the necklace that she has around her neck was something that Sarah's husband used to say, love each day, right? And it also helps explain why Juno wasn't around more after the accident and why she feels protective or indebted to Sarah. She says at one point, I'm not leaving without Sarah, when they have an opportunity to escape the cave. So I've seen other versions of this film which end differently than the one that's been uploaded here. I think in another version, the film ends right when she sees Juno sitting next to her in the car. But in this version, spoiler alert, right, she sees that and then she wakes up and she's still in the cave. So it kind of makes you wonder, does she get out? There actually is a sequel to this movie as well, which uses the ending where she does get out as its premise, because the sequel involves Sarah leading a search party back down into the pit to find, and they find out that Juno is actually still alive. The sequel is obviously not as good as the first one, but anyway, this raises the question, I mean, horror we know disrupts closure, but does Sarah escape? Does she become whole again through re-emerging from the pit? Is she at peace with her daughter's death? And even if she doesn't actually escape the pit, I guess I'm just wondering, one thing you could write about for this week is how do you read the end of this film in terms of completing or not completing a descent narrative as Rushing outlines it. So I also want to talk about Frankenstein this week. We haven't really talked about this novel. I've sort of been saving it for now. In the preface to the novel, I want to think of the novel as a monstrous creation in and of itself, sort of comparing Victor's creation of this human monster to Shelley's writing of this novel. And in the preface, we're told that the following tale is the only one which has been completed. The backstory here being that during the summer of 1816, a volcano erupted in the Dutch East Indies and Mount Tambora, which resulted in seasonal abnormalities for the entire summer and left most of Europe much colder than normal. So it's actually known as the year without summer, because of the atmospheric change that this volcano erupting created. So Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, this was before they were married, I believe, but also Lord Byron and John William Polidori were together in Geneva and decided to have a contest to see who could create the scariest story. And that's what this line refers to. The following tale is the only one which has been completed. Shelley is sort of taking pride here in finishing her narrative where the others kind of didn't complete theirs. But this is also interesting because Percy Shelley actually wrote this preface, writing for as Mary Shelley. But anyway, the context under which this story was written seems crucial for two reasons. First of all, the climate of this year without a summer sort of informs the climate of the novel, right? The cold summer explains the cold setting. Frankenstein and his monster sort of continually move north as the novel just gets colder and colder and darker and darker. But it's also significant for the female authorship. Shelley seems to have something to prove to her male competitors in this contest of writing, who can come up with the scariest story. Who these men were established men of letters already. We get a double sense from the above statement that Mary Shelley is proud of her creation, but also that her narrative has been co-opted by her husband's or by Percy Shelley's voice, since Percy is the one who actually wrote these lines. So there's the way in which a male voice kind of intruding on this narrative might be contributing to a sort of monstrous quality to it. So a question I have here is how is Frankenstein a feminist text? Is it a feminist text? Is a text feminist simply because a woman wrote it? How do you see Mary Shelley identifying, analyzing, or rejecting patriarchal structures in her narrative form and content? Is this a story about a man who seeks to give life to another man without the help of a woman and the repercussions which follow? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I feel like we haven't really defined feminism or what makes something a feminist text, but that's something I'm trying to think about for every text that we've looked at so far this semester. When Victor Frankenstein reads over Walton's documentation of his narrative, he seems to demonstrate a concern of his narrative, which emphasizes Walton as a kind of passive narrator who is willing to have his text augmented. He says, Frankenstein discovered that I made notes concerning his history. He asked to see them and then himself corrected and augmented them in many places. Since you have preserved my narration, said he, I would not that a mutilated one should go down to posterity. My question is, does this speak to how Shelley resisted or accepted critique of her novel in terms of sharing it with these men that she was having this contest with? How does this passage link a potentially mutilated narrative with the mutilated monster that Victor creates in the novel? And also, I think there's room here to think about how this novel is a break from other novels of the period in which she is writing. Again, Williams, I think, points out that the history of the horror genre is, when you're thinking about feminist approaches to the horror genre, it's important to consider how women were prominent authors of the Gothic novel, out of which horror arguably emerges, and I think Shelley is a great example of that. But Tanya Modolewski also points out that horror undoes the novelistic as a family romance, in that it forbids closure, it prevents an easy narcissistic identification with the primary protagonists, and it does not develop characters thoroughly. So there's room here to think about how Shelley's novel is a precursor to horror film as well, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Frankenstein's monster disrupts the nuclear family. Victor's creation disrupts the nuclear family, especially as this well-to-do family seems to be what is put at risk in the novel. And what Splice and Lars Schmink help to highlight is that Victor's poor parenting is really to blame. This is, in some ways, what Splice emphasizes is that this novel is about parenting. It seems to be about bad fathers and absent mothers, right? So after Victor creates his monster, he sleeps, and he says, I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health walking the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of her flannel. So here he dreams he has given birth to his own mother. And while I'm sure there's a Freudian reading of this scene available, I think we get a sense that he is motivated in his scientific pursuits to conquer death, but that his means of doing so disrupt the traditional idea of family. Right? There are a lot of incestuous implications of him growing up with his cousin and having hopes of marrying her in order to fulfill his mother's dying wish, which also seems to flirt with some social taboos about that his monstrous creation only seemed to amplify. And here I'm highlighting the word imprinted because it reminds me of what Ginger and Fred do in Splice, those hybrid creations in that film, who imprint with one. I think that's the word they use. So I think there's a connection to perhaps be explored, but I'm not going to go into that. Another way in which the monster seems to disrupt this nuclear family, Victor's mother represents a kind of ideal child showing devotion to her parents, which is also a very patriarchal image in the sense that she's represented as being devotional to her father, to her dead father. Victor's creation does away with this image of patriarchal obedience that his mother represents in this painting. So he says, 6 years had elapsed, passed in a dream, but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved and venerable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was an historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort, my mother, in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. And this is what's kind of done away with when Victor creates this monster. So there's a contrast being set up here between the generations. Another way that Victor's creation disrupts this nuclear family is that it also disrupts the sanctity of the marriage contract. When he's commissioned to create this a female version of this monster for his creation, he feels compelled to do it before he gets married. So, could I enter into a festival with this deadly weight yet hanging around my neck and bowing me to the ground? I must perform my engagement and let the monster depart with his mate before I allow myself to enjoy the delight of a union from which I expected peace. So he changes the connotation of the word engagement here and puts his obligation to his monster before his obligation to his fiancée. He must create a woman for his monster before he can be happy with his wife. And finally, Frankenstein's threat haunts Victor after he breaks his contract to build for his monster a female companion. Frankenstein's threat, the monster's threat being, remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night, right? Which also has disturbing incestuous implications. Here, the monster seems to stand in for his bride in many ways as a preoccupation. The novel makes implicit what the film Splice makes explicit, that unnatural human procreation has consequences, right? Schmink's argument is that this novel is actually about parenting as much as it is about experimenting with artificial procreation. Victor fails to take responsibility for his creation / child and his family, but especially the women in his family end up suffering for it. Justine here is condemned even though she is innocent, right? Victor says, I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom, and would not forego their hold. So the question here is, how are women treated or represented in this novel? But also, it's interesting here that Victor tries to show himself as a victim, even though Justine is the real victim of his silence. So there's a way in which he sort of has narrative control here, and wants the reader to feel this empathy for him, which I guess I have trouble doing in this moment. Justine exposes how witch hunts and social pressures create false confessions. Here, too, we see how the actions of the monster in question are projected onto and internalized by an innocent woman. Justine says how she did confess, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier in my heart than all my other sins. The God of heaven forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. So there's also this identification between her and this monster. She's sort of internalizing through these patriarchal accusations. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. Dear lady, I had none to support me. All looked on me as a wretch doomed to ignominy and perdition. What could I do? In an evil hour I subscribed to a lie, and now only am I truly miserable. So this scene seems to expose the inimical social damage done by patriarchy. All Victor has to do to be exonerated, or to exonerate Justine, is to say, all Victor has to do to exonerate himself is to say nothing, and he does. He just lets Justine die and be executed. This novel also seems to inaugurate something of a monstrous gaze, which we have been exploring this semester so far. In fact, the monster acquires language and culture through a cinematic peephole. He is all the more monstrous for his voyeurism, it seems. But his education suggests that his gaze is not his by choice, right? He's not a pervert by choice, but a victim of his condition. So he tells us how he sort of learned culture by watching Felix and his father and his sister through this peephole. On examining my dwelling, I found that one of the windows of the cottage had formerly occupied a part of it, but the panes had been filled up with wood, and one of these was a small and almost imperceptible chink through which the eye could just penetrate. So he's watching all this through a very small hole, which kind of gives it this cinematic quality. And furthermore, he also admits to experiencing pleasure from watching this family scene. He seems to watch a melodrama unfold and eagerly seeks to break the fourth wall. He says night quickly shut in, but to my extreme wonder, I found that the cottagers had a means of prolonging light by the use of tapers or candles, and was delighted to find that the setting of the sun did not put an end to the pleasure I experienced in watching my human neighbors. So the body genre of this scene he watches perhaps contributes to his later melancholy and murderous rage. And I also think it's worth noting that the male gaze in this scene sort of becomes synonymous with Orientalism. The history and melodrama that unfolds between Felix and Safi about a white Christian hero rescuing a condemned Turk from being wrongfully persecuted and winning the affection and religious and cultural conversion of his Islamic daughter. This is like a very European construction of the East, especially since Safi's Turkish father is represented as an oppressive patriarch who is ungrateful for being rescued and can't acknowledge the quote-unquote sacrifice made by the French aristocratic family and the exile that they suffer. But that's sort of a side note. So once the monster becomes educated, he reflects on the pain that knowledge has brought him, which I think evokes this question: how does Shelley revise an Eve narrative, like the Paradise or Paradise Lost? Because he comes to understand his condition and his isolation, right? He has also read Milton, we know, and he understands that the knowledge he has acquired through his peephole has evicted him from his Eden. He has tasted the fruit of knowledge. But again, regarding our question of whether or not this is a feminist text, we should consider what Shelley is attempting to do here. Is she putting the apple in Adam's hands, so to speak, since the monster seems to have a choice to remain in oblivion, but chooses to watch, however voyeuristically? So he says, I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted on me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat, of what strange nature is knowledge. So, again, the question here is, does this turn the Eve narrative into one where a misogynist reading is impossible? because women do not create in this narrative. Because Eve is Eve in a patriarchal narrative is blamed for man being exiled from paradise. So that's not really possible here because there's no woman. So is her message in this novel that if men should ever try to procreate without women, they will only produce monsters who will destroy their families? While there are not too many women in this text, I think there is an argument to be made about this text's feminist goals, especially because of how the novel interrogates male creations. The monster's gaze turns from voyeurism to a more carceral gauge, as de Tora talks about, once he commissions Victor to build him a female companion. He says, "Depart to your home and commence your labors," when he's commissioning Victor to build this female companion. "I shall watch their progress with unutterable anxiety, and fear not but that when you are ready I shall appear." So here, the monster showcases his omniscience as a kind of oppressive force. But in the second quote, we sort of see Victor's anxiety that this gaze, this kind of invisible watching, produces in him. "Thus situated, employed in the most detestable occupation, immersed in a solitude where nothing could for an instant call my attention from the actual scene in which I was engaged, my spirits became unequal. I grew restless and nervous. Every moment I feared to meet my persecutor." So he always has this feeling that he's being watched. During one of his lessons, the monster learns about the history of the colonization of the Americas, and he sympathizes with the Native American populations. He says the book from which Felix instructed Safi was Volney's Ruins of Empires. "I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Safi over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants." And I think this contributes to how the monster is being racialized in this text. His empathy for South American Indians plants an idea in the monster's head. He says, "If you consent, neither you nor any other human being shall ever see us again. I will go to the vast wilds of South America with my female companion," right? "My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. My companion will be of the same nature as myself, and will be content with the same fare. We shall make our bed of dried leaves. The sun will shine on us as on man and will ripen our food. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human, and you must feel that you could deny it only in the wantonness of power and cruelty." So when the monster commissions Victor to create this female companion for him, he assures Victor that he will be happy then and will go to South America, which is imagined here as a kind of paradise regained. But Shelley's and the monster's conception of South America is problematically represented as an open space, uninhabited by humans, where a monster and his female companion might live in harmony. It's sort of imagined as an Eden, right? The problem with this is that it seems to conflate this monster with the people who do live in South America at this moment, suggesting that the monster will fit right in. It seems to essentialize the entire population of the continent, suggesting that they all live a very similar way, which collapses cultural differences. And also, I find this suggestion of just kind of living off of acorns and berries maybe a little problematic for the same reasons. So Victor imagines the threat of a monstrous procreation and eventually talks himself out of creating a female companion for his monster. But he does this through imagining the two in South America in the monster's Edenic vision. He says, "Even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the demon thirsted would be children, and a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror." So again, a South American Eden is imagined here as a desert, a depopulated space. But colonization doesn't only depopulate the Americas of its original inhabitants, it actually replaces the indigenous population with an invasive European population. His concern here relates to Briggs's article about Jurassic Park, I think. Here, Victor seems to have this choice to prevent the creation of a potentially uncontrollable female sexuality and its reproductive capabilities, and he chooses not to make her at all. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't consider building an infertile womb for a woman in order to prevent this. It is as if he will only make an anatomically correct woman or no woman at all. Like, those are the only two options he can imagine. Which perhaps suggests that his patriarchal understanding of a woman's function is only to procreate. So if this monster is racialized, its race intersects with the geography and with the promised female body and the threat posed by the ability for these two creatures to procreate in South America. I think one thing that troubles the feminism of this text is Victor's aversion to the female body. While a man made of composed body parts is created and sort of carried through, Victor's refusal to create a female monster seems to position the female body as somehow more disgusting than even the most disfigured male body. And we get some examples of this. He says, "I found that I could not compose a female without again devoting several months to profound study and laborious disquisition." So it's kind of this huge inconvenience to do all this work again. But also, he says, it was indeed a filthy process in which I was engaged. So after his monster commissions him to create a female companion, he realizes he must do more work to create a female and imagines that it's sort of a filthy process in a way that maybe creating a man's body was not. But Victor also reasons himself out of his task. He says, "I was now about to form another being of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight, for its own sake, in murder and wretchedness." He had sworn to quit the neighborhood of man and hide himself in deserts, again imagining South America here as a desert or unpopulated space. But she had not, and she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with a compact made before her creation. They might even hate each other. The creature who already lived loathed his own deformity, and might he not conceive a greater abhorrence for it when it came before his eyes in female form? So, while his reasoning calls attention to the patriarchal assumptions of the original monster, who, like an audience of the cinema of the male gaze, takes it for granted that a woman who is his same species will offer no objection to being his sexual companion and running away with him to a kind of Eden. Victor's reasoning ultimately emphasizes the horror of a woman's body. So note how his use of pronouns, I think it's significant the way that his pronouns also jump back and forth from she to it. Like here at the bottom, for it, when it came before his eyes in female form. He seems to imagine that his monster will agree with him and will also, in the same way that he does, find her body disgusting and terrifying in a way that a man's would not be. So a big question I have by the end of this novel is where our sympathies lie. In this moment when the monster confronts Walton over Victor's dead body, he says, "Think ye the groans of Clerval were music to my ears? My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot even imagine." So he's sort of saying that he has a human heart, even though he doesn't really have a human form. He also says, "Am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me? Why do you not hate Felix, who drove his friend from his door with contumely? Why do you not execrate the rustic who sought to destroy the savior of his child? Nay, these are virtuous and immaculate beings. I, the miserable and abandoned, am an abortion, to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. Even now my blood boils at the recollection of this injustice. So are we supposed to ultimately sympathize with this monster? Is my question. Walton tells him that the monster's repentance is useless at this point because he did not listen to his conscience. But I'm not sure that Walton speaks for the reader. Are we supposed to want to embrace this monster where Walton rejects him? The question he poses to the reader seem valid. The questions that this monster is posing seem valid. Like, do we not villainize the rustic who shoots him for saving his child, or Felix? And I feel like the gaze of this monster seems once again significant. Or maybe not the gaze, but maybe our gaze of it, right? We are perhaps better positioned to forgive the monster or to empathize with him, partly because we don't see him in the way that the characters in the novel do. Like Schrodinger's cat, actually seeing this creature might change this narrative for us. But in the novel, everyone who sees the monster cannot help but hate and detest him. So what is Shelley doing by giving readers this tension between sympathizing with the murderer and not giving us a fair indication of what this creature actually looks like? And I think that's also another way in which this novel really connects to the film, the medium of film, in a very interesting way. And I'd actually be curious to watch Kenneth Branagh's film version of this, which I hear is a pretty true. It stays true to the novel in ways that the earlier, more famous versions of the film do not. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this novel and how it relates to the film. I'm looking forward to looking at your final projects. Please see the final project prompt sheet, which is posted on the welcome page, the first page of our course website. Remember, these are due on January 23rd at noon. That's a hard deadline because I have to get grades in within like 48 hours of that, I think. So I need those. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I also just want to say thank you for a great, if brief, semester. And I wish you all the best of luck with everything from here. And that's all. Thank you.